Good evening to everyone and welcome to today's session. PGI is on any given day an interesting exam. At least what I found was there are too many classified lists, classification of glaucoma, classification of too many classified lists have been given. Your job is very easy to identify A, B, C, D and then answer it. So, but the point of interest here is not only the specific issues of the topics, but also a general outlook towards the topics is also important to crack the PGI exam. So, before we start the discussion, let me once more thank our students who are in fact eligible to take the entrance of PGI. Teacher is not eligible. So, after coming out, they written all the questions and then sent us across. Dr. Vijay from Vizag, and also thanks goes to Malikarjun from Vijayawada, Bharavi from Guntur, Shweta and her colleagues from Secunderabad, and Harshavardhan from Tirupati and Prasad. So with that, let us make the start of today's discussion. The function of the latissimus dorsi on the shoulder joint, what is it specifically? We need to remember that the latissimus dorsi is important for the extension, adduction, transverse extension and internal rotation of the shoulder joint. And it also has got a synergistic role in the extension and the lateral flexion of the lumbar spine is what need to be basically remembered. That's the reason it's very important for the adduction and internal rotation are the two important properties of the latissimus dorsi. Rectus sheath is very important right from the days of anatomy dissection. So we need to remember that there are some anastomoses that occur between the thoracic aorta and the descending aorta at the level of the rectus sheath. That's the reason whenever there is any atherosclerotic narrowing of the aorta, then all these collaterals will be basically be bypassing that narrowing of the aorta. So that's the reason from a surgical anatomy perspective this is a very important question. So we need to know that the superior epigastric artery, inferior epigastric artery, internal thoracic and the left subclavian, they all form the collateral vessels and connect the thoracic aorta and the abdominal aorta to one another. So that's the reason the epigastric vessels will finally form anastomosis with the branches of the subclavian in order to bypass any obstruction at the level of the descending aorta is what you need to basically remember. Now let us talk about latissimus dorsi. Where do we use that in the surgery? In the breast reconstruction, shortly some of you are going to join MS general surgery. Mastectomy is a very routine process, and after mastectomy you will be planning for the reconstruction flap. For that you need to know latissimus dorsi anatomy. The latissimus dorsi is supplied by 6th, 7th and 8th cervical nerves through the thoracodorsal nerve. So the latissimus dorsi has got the thoracodorsal nerve. And what is importance of the long thoracic nerve, doctor? The long thoracic, otherwise called the nerve of Bell, it is the one which supplies the serratus anterior, not the latissimus dorsi, as all of you know. We use for the reconstruction the latissimus dorsi myocutaneous flap very much, and the importance of the latissimus dorsi is it is one of the biggest muscle harvest with a single vascular pedicle, which is a very convenient thing for a plastic surgeon while reconstructing is what you have to basically remember. There's a reason the answer would be a single vascular pedicle is a true statement. It is very much used as a muscle flap is what need to be fundamentally remembered. Anatomical snuff box is a very favorite question of the examiner. The medial border of it is formed by the tendon of the extensor pollicis longus. The lateral border is by the tendons of the extensor pollicis brevis and adductor pollicis longus, and the styloid process of the radius is a part of its floor. So these are all the true statements about it. The only thing which is not a part or a content of it is the adductor pollicis longus is not a part of it, is what I like to underscore. Whereas the other structures, the radial artery is very much a part of it, it will be passing through it, cephalic vein will be draining out of it. They are all the true statements. Now lateral pterygoid versus medial pterygoid. What is the nerve supply? What is the specific action? Mechanism of action is a favorite topic. So the lateral pterygoid will be lowering the mandible, it will be opening the jaw, and it will be helping the medial pterygoids in order to move the jaw in the lateral sideward movement. And there are in fact 3 muscles of mastication. Out of the 3, what is the importance of the lateral pterygoid? Out of all the 3, it is only the lateral pterygoid which is capable of opening the jaw. That is a very specific function of it. Now where is the lateral pterygoid basically originating from? Is it from the medial surface of the lateral pterygoid or the lateral surface of the lateral pterygoid? What is the difference between the origin of the lateral pterygoid muscle and medial pterygoid muscle? We must be sure about. The lateral pterygoid muscle will be originating from the lateral surface of the lateral pterygoid plate, and the medial pterygoid muscle will be originating from the medial surface of the pterygoid plate. So that is the difference between the site of origin of the medial and lateral pterygoid. So the option A is absolutely wrong, that it is not the medial surface, rather it is the lateral surface of the medial pterygoid plate, from where it will be originating is what need to be remembered. Now finally, where does it go and undergo the insertion? It will be finally be inserting onto the medial, it will be finally inserting onto as mentioned in the options into the fovea of the neck of the mandible is very much a true statement. Then what is the nerve supply of the lateral pterygoid, doctor? It is not the 7th nerve. It is the mandibular division of the 5th cranial nerve. It is the one which will be innervating the lateral pterygoid muscle is what you have to specifically remember. Now let us talk about right ventricle. This is also another traditional question. Right ventricle is more anterior, left ventricle is more posterior between the 2 ventricles. Many times we discussed this in our review sessions. You can see that this is the sternum, doctor, this is the right ventricle, this is the left atrium, and then here you can see the bronchus, this is the ascending aorta, this is the arch of aorta, here they are the vertebral bodies, and here you can see the inferior vena cava which is passing. So you must be very sure on the projection of the lateral radiograph. So right ventricle is more anterior is very much a true statement. Now is the tricuspid and the pulmonary valve are in continuity or in discontinuity? They are very much in discontinuity from each other. And if you talk about trabeculae, but before we go to trabeculae, what are the structures that you see in the PA view of the chest radiograph? You can see the SVC, arch of aorta, then left ventricle, and the right atrium, left atrium, but right ventricle is not a part of the AP projection because it is more a anterior structure is what I like to once more re-enunciate for you. Now let us talk about this very important option given. What is the importance of crista supraventricularis? It is a ridge in the embryonic life which will be directing the blood flow from the right ventricle into the pulmonary valve, which is the right ventricular outflow tract. For the blood to get directed from the right ventricle towards its outflow tract, we require the crista supraventricularis is very much a true statement out of all. Now finally we need to decide about option D, that is the trabeculae in the right ventricle. Here there is a small issue about the trabeculae. If you say trabeculae are relatively coarse compared in the right ventricle compared to left ventricle, but they are relatively few, they are more straight and they tend to be parallel, directing the blood towards the outflow tract. So that's the reason right ventricle versus left ventricle, if you compare, the right ventricular trabeculae are more coarse but less in number is what you have to be very, very sure about. Now let's go to the next question. Young male with a fibular neck fracture with a lateral peroneal nerve injury, then what are the important muscular and sensory disturbances that you come across? This is a very traditional question. Sciatic nerve, which divides into the tibial and common peroneal, and what are the branches of tibial and common peroneal, what is the innervation of the lower limb, and also cutaneous innervation of the brachial plexus. Invariably one question comes shortly, what is the next exam you are taking after PGI 2008? UPSC, state entrance, all India, anything you write, these are all the traditional questions. So this is, if you look back the days of anatomy, after dissecting the front part, we turn the cadaver and then start from the back, popliteal fossa dissection. So you can remember the division of the sciatic into the common peroneal and also into the tibial nerve, and the common peroneal, if at all there is any injury in the fibular neck fracture, then it will cause foot drop, it will also cause the sensation disturbances very much, and it is a dorsiflexion of the foot which become compromised whenever there is any trauma to this nerve, and there is a sensory loss along the dorsum surface, not the plantar surface of the foot, and the portions of the anterior and lower lateral leg. Lateral leg is in turn divided into upper lateral and lower lateral part of the leg cutaneous innervation. So lower lateral leg cutaneous innervation is also by the peroneal nerve, which also become disturbed if there is any peroneal nerve injury, is what need to be remembered. Now pectoralis major, what is the blood supply? There are so many muscles, who will remember every muscle's blood supply difficult, but pectoralis major is important because you will be shortly MS general surgery operating on breast, and pectoralis major is one of the major issues you will be operating day in and day out. So that's the reason, doctor, we need to know what are the branches of the axillary artery that form the scapular anastomosis, one of the favorite topics of the examiner. The superficial cervical, suprascapular, circumflex scapular and subscapular, the various divisions which come out of the axillary artery, they form what are called the scapular anastomosis. Now you have got one of the branches of the axillary called the thoracoacromial artery, otherwise called acromiothoracic artery. It is this thoracoacromial artery which is the major blood supply to the pectoralis major muscle, is what you need to basically remember. So speaking on much finer terms, we need to remember that there is one pectoral branch of the thoracoacromial artery, there is an acromial branch, clavicular branch and deltoid branch. Out of them, the pectoral branch of the thoracoacromial is the one which is the major source of the blood supply to the pectoralis major, is what I like to finally underscore to all of you. Now let us talk about visual cortex and the blood supply. Is it very important as a future DM neurology, is it important for you? Definitely. There will be transient ischemic attacks where there is a loss of the vision, amaurosis, fugax, etc., etc. So you must know that ACA, MCA, PCA, what are the territories, what do they supply, how will be the stroke clinical presentation. Invariably one question comes in the CVA, if you escape in general medicine you have it in anatomy, invariably. So today only take an opportunity to review that, doctor. So the visual cortex is the Brodmann area 17, and it is the calcarine branch of the posterior cerebral artery which is the blood supply to the visual cortex, is what you need to basically remember. Now this is our agreement. One question on brachial plexus, median, ulnar. Without that there is no question paper. So now quickly tell doctor what are the main branches, motor and sensory branches. Any number of times we revise median, ulnar and radial nerve branches, still it is a topic worth of revising. In upper arm there is no motor innervation from the median nerve. In the forearm it is all the flexors of the forearm which it will be innervating. The only exception is the flexor carpi ulnaris is not innervated by the median nerve. And also the medial 2 digits of the flexor digitorum profundus also are not from the median nerve, because these two muscles in the flexor compartment, that is the flexor carpi ulnaris and the medial half of the flexor digitorum profundus, they are basically innervated by the ulnar nerve, not the median nerve, as all of you know. Now finally what does it supply, the median nerve? It supplies pronata teres, flexor carpi radialis, palmaris longus, flexor digitorum superficialis, and the lateral half of the flexor digitorum profundus, flexor pollicis longus and pronata quadratus, they are all innervated by the median nerve. Then in the hand it will be innervating the first and second lumbricals and the muscles of the thenar eminence. Thenar eminence muscles are also innervated by the recurrent branch of the median nerve. Now what are called as muscles of thenar eminence? There are 3 muscles. You have opponens pollicis going to the thumb, flexor pollicis brevis and abductor pollicis brevis, not adductor. These three muscles are called the muscles of thenar eminence. Even they are also innervated by the median nerve is what need to be basically remembered. Finally, we have this fellow which is the solar muscle in the thumb, which is not by the median nerve, rather by the ulnar nerve. It is the adductor pollicis which is innervated by the ulnar nerve rather than by the median nerve is what you need to finally remember. Now let us go to the next question. There are totally six extensor compartments in the hand. The last week dissection in the anatomy days, the entire humerus will be visible, radius ulna will be visible, and finally you will be plucking out the fine nerves in your anatomy dissection. So what are the components, each of the six components, which muscles are there in the six components of extensor compartment of the hand is a favorite topic of examiner. Why are we very much interested about the first extensor compartment? What is the clinical condition associated with that? We have a tenosynovitis of De Quervain, which is associated with the tenosynovitis of the first extensor compartment of the hand. Many times we reviewed this. So this inflamed tendon can undergo tenosynovitis, that is how there can be a pain. Finkelstein test in De Quervain's tenosynovitis, as all of you know very well. Now in the first compartment, extensor compartment, you have two muscles, abductor pollicis longus, extensor pollicis brevis. Second compartment, there is extensor carpi radialis longus and extensor carpi radialis brevis. Third compartment, you have got extensor pollicis longus. Fourth compartment, three tendons of extensor digitorum and extensor indicis. Fifth compartment is digiti minima extensor, and sixth compartment is extensor carpi ulnaris. Now what is the difference between smart and unsmart preparation? A unsmart preparation is to remember all the six, which is not tested. What is generally tested, you review any of the old question bank, is the first compartment, which is commonly tested. The remaining five are meant to be reviewed after entrance. So that is how you postpone few things, have courage to postpone, but don't postpone essential things. That is the final gist of solving the old questions or anything. So this is also important clinically. Tomorrow as a rheumatologist, you will be injecting into the first extensor compartment. For that you will be directing the needle proximally towards the radial styloid, and you will be injecting the anesthetic into it in the case of the De Quervain's tenosynovitis. Now let us go to the next question. What constitutes nasal septum? It is more or less like a short answer questions of university exam. So we must be sure it is a perpendicular plate of the ethmoid, the vomer and the cartilage of the septum, which are the constituents of the nasal septum, is what need to be remembered. Another short notes, Kieselbach's plexus or Little's area, you are already very sure. It is the anterior ethmoid artery, greater palatine artery, sphenopalatine artery and superior labial artery which constitute the Little's area, which is a favorite topic of the PGI question bank. Anytime you answer past 10 years papers, many times asked. Now once more another traditional question. Recurrent laryngeal nerve, everything except the cricothyroid, which is innervated by the superior laryngeal nerve, as all of you know very well. Now through the superior orbital fissure, what are the various structures that will be passing? It is the oculomotor, trochlear, ophthalmic division of the trigeminal, abducens and the ophthalmic vein. They are the various constituents of the superior orbital fissure is what need to be remembered. Now the iliofemoral ligament. Why is it very important, doctor? Because it is one of the very strong ligament, also called as the Y ligament or the ligament of the Bigelow is the other name which is being given to it. It is from the ilium to the femur in the front of the hip joint. It is how it is basically extending. So does it arise from the ascis, that is the anterior superior iliac spine, or does it arise from the anterior inferior iliac spine? You need to just brush back your memory. So it is the anterior inferior iliac spine and the rim of the acetabulum. It will be arising and it will be spreading obliquely downwards and lateral towards the intertrochanteric line in the anterior side of the femoral head. That is how basically it is extended, is what you need to fundamentally remember. Now one more question on the brachial plexus. What is the difference between Klump's paralysis versus Erb's paralysis? And whenever the lower root got involved, that is in the Klump's paralysis, will the hand show abnormality always or only sometimes? This is the issue in this question. Let us debate on that. It is the fifth cervical vertebra to the first thoracic, C5 to T1 is the composition of the brachial plexus roots. So you have an upper, middle and inferior root is what need to be remembered. Then you have got the divisions and in turn you have got the cords, and you must know what nerves come from each of these cords. The last revision forever. It is the lateral pectoral nerve, musculocutaneous and lateral root of the median nerve from the lateral cord. Rats, that is the radial nerve and the axillary nerve and the lower subscapular, thoracodorsal and upper subscapular, they all arise from the posterior cord. And from the medial cord you have got the ulnar nerve, medial cutaneous nerve of the arm and the medial branch of the median nerve and the medial pectoral nerve, they are all from the medial cord. Once more I leave it for a quick revision to you. The various root values, various branches is a favorite question of the examiner. Now the question is, whenever there is a Klump's paralysis with the lower root involvement, what will happen? There is definitely paralysis of the upper limb and lower part of the upper limb, that is the elbow movements, forearm movements. But the hand may or may not be involved, not invariably involved once there is a Klump's paralysis. It depends upon which roots are involved, is a very, very important issue about it. And it can also lead to the development of the Horner syndrome also, is what I like to underscore. And shoulder dystocia is a common predisposing obstetrical reason for the development of the brachial plexus injury. Now let us talk about the extracellular potassium, hyperkalemia, action potential curve. Lot of questions come from this important topic. Whenever the ECF potassium values decrease, what will happen? There is a hyperpolarization of the resting membrane potential. That means it becomes more negative. And naturally that will make it to become less excitable rather than being more excitable, is what need to be basically remembered. Now there is a paradoxical effect of hypokalemia on the nerves versus heart. In the case of nerves, this hyperpolarization will make them less excitable. But when you talk about the heart, the hypokalemia has got a reverse effect. That is, it will make the myocytes to become hyperexcitable rather than becoming hypoexcitable, is what need to be remembered. So arrhythmias are a consequence of hypokalemia, and cardiac asystole is a consequence of hyperkalemia, is what we need to be doubly sure about. So there is an increasing excitability with a decreased resting membrane potential with hyperkalemia on the nerve, and hyperkalemia causes a decreased amplitude of the action potential, and it will make the repolarization to become very much prolonged. These are all the effects of the dysregulatemia, hyperkalemia upon the action potential. Now let us talk about facilitated diffusion. What is the difference between active transport, simple diffusion and facilitated diffusion? Active transport is a process that requires ATPs and energy. Facilitated diffusion does not require ATPs, is the point of interest and issue in this question. It is not dependent on the energy. So that is the reason, doctor, carrier mediated transport is, facilitated diffusion is energy dependent, is a wrong statement. It is not energy dependent, is a true statement, is what need to be remembered. Then it definitely requires transport proteins, and you have got the transmembrane carrier proteins for doing that, and the carrier protein will have a very specific binding towards a specific substance, and there is no energy involved. These are all the true statements about it. Now what is inferior cerebellar peduncle middle cerebellar peduncle and superior cerebellar peduncle, very simple. Cerebellum, what is the science teacher's word about it? Choti dimag. You have got a badi dimag, that is called as, what is that? Cerebral cortex. So this small brain cerebellum fellow is unwanted by the big brain. So he will be clinging to it with 3 ropes. What are the 3 ropes? Inferior, middle and superior cerebellar peduncle. Will it throw the ropes directly onto the cerebral cortex? No, there is a brainstem. So the medulla, the lowest part of brainstem, is connected to the cerebellum by inferior cerebellar peduncle. Pons is connected to the cerebellum by middle cerebellar peduncle, and midbrain is connected by superior cerebellar peduncle. So naturally, if you know this simple law, you know all this, you can answer this. The pontocerebellar tract is a part of middle cerebellar peduncle, not that of inferior. Whereas the cuneo-cerebellar, vestibulocerebellar and the dorsal columns coming from the spinal cord, that is a dorsal spinocerebellar tract, they all basically require, the inferior cerebellar peduncle is what I like to underscore to all of you. Now there is a very important nucleus called the inferior olivary nucleus, which is closely related to the inferior cerebellar peduncle. So you have a olivocerebellar tract, which is also associated with the inferior cerebellar peduncle. So finally, what are the 4 tracts in inferior cerebellar peduncle? You remember: dorsal spinocerebellar, cuneo-cerebellar, vestibulocerebellar and olivocerebellar. So these are the 4 things that are related to the inferior cerebellar peduncle, is what you need to remember, at least for the, it's called as music preparation for marriage. Just before the bridegroom arrives, bride will be learning Carnatic music. So neuroanatomy should be learnt like that. Before exam, you must know at least, please sing one Tyagaraja Kruti, you must know that you should not sing a rock song. So at least that much knowledge is required. Honestly speaking, only after joining MD, while seeing patients and then having neurological case presentation, that time we learned what is peduncle at all. So we don't know peduncle belongs to cerebrum or spinal cord or to the bladder. So that was the level of ignorance we all suffered. So the middle cerebellar peduncle has got pontocerebellar tract, which will connect with the contralateral pontine gray. Finally, you have superior cerebellar tract, which connects to the midbrain. So what is the very important nucleus in the midbrain? You have red nucleus. So that is the reason you are having the tract which connects the red nucleus is the end cerebellum. Rubrocerebellar tract is the one which passes through the superior cerebellar peduncle, is what need to be remembered. Now let us talk about spermatogenesis. We require FSH. Can we use the word FSH for spermatogenesis? It's a misnomer. There are no follicles in sperms, unlike the ovary, right? But we are continuing the term. Then LH is also important, produced by the, which is very important for the stimulation of testosterone production. Testosterone is also important, and for the LH and FSH to be produced, GnRH is important. That's the reason all the 4 are very much important. There is no surprise about it, is what I like to underscore to all of you. Then why FSH is important? FSH will stimulate the production of the androgen binding protein by the Sertoli cells. It also will help the formation of the blood testis barrier. That's the reason FSH is important. Then LH is very important because once LH goes and stimulates the Leydig cells, testosterone production is very much regulated. That's the reason we require the LH also. Now let us go to the next question. I leave all this literature to you to quickly review the process of spermatogenesis. Now what does cortisol does? Once there is cortisol, our glucose levels will shoot. So glycogenolysis should occur, gluconeogenesis should occur, and lipolysis should occur. So there are the 3 things that basically happen once there is a excess amount of the cortisol. When one object meets other, then there is a transfer of energy. I never understood it throughout my life. What is the meaning of the forensic principle? But anyway, we had been reading that the moment that question first three words come, Locard's principle, where is it, you will take the answer. So then oxygen dissociation curve, shift to right and left, right from the days of William Harvey, this question had been asked in the entrance. You must know that left shift means increased affinity. Right shift means right away it will give away oxygen. It won't wait for having it with it. So temperature, if it is high, 2,3 dpg if it is high, PCO2 if it is high, carbon monoxide if it is low, they all lead to the development of the right shift is what you need to basically remember. Similarly, pH also, acidosis will lead to right shift, and adult hemoglobin has a right shift, whereas the fetal hemoglobin has a higher affinity, hence it has got a left shift is what you need to basically remember. What is importance of platelet? Platelet is a silent chemical bomb. It releases so many chemical substances which can stimulate the inflammation, cause vasoconstriction, can lead to a lot of systemic effects. So examiner is seriously interested whether you know it or not. Clot retraction is one of the important functions of the platelets, is a true statement, is what need to be remembered. Then it secretes platelet derived growth factor, and also the platelets will adhere to the subendothelial surface. And what is that substance between platelet and subendothelium? For it to go and adhere, you require the von Willebrand factor is required. So this is another important principle. Then the ADP, thromboxane, etc., they all basically are important for the platelet aggregation to occur. And how does platelets contribute for the clot retraction? What is the underlying mechanism? It is the thrombasthinin, which is a factor released by the platelets, which leads to the development of the clot retraction, hence they are very much important for that. Then thromboxane is also a very potent vasoconstrictor. This reason platelets indirectly have a role in producing a vasoconstriction is what I like to underscore to all of you. Then one of the options given to you is it is very important for the formation of the prothrombinase complex. Let's have 1-2 comments about it. What is this complex? The moment the factor 8 becomes an active factor, then the factor 8A, the factor 9A and the calcium together they basically form what is called as a prothrombinase complex. So when all great people need to meet at one place, they require a venue. And where is that venue? It is on the surface of the platelets. That is the reason platelets are also important for the prothrombinase complex to form, and the clotting process requires the platelets for that reason is what need to be basically remembered. Now where are the potassium levels high? As a nephrologist, every day you need to talk about what food to eat for your chronic renal failure patient. Bananas, oranges, potatoes, tomatoes, cucumber, cabbage, cauliflower, you get a feeling as a vegetable vendor that these are all the things that contain the potassium in a very high level is what I like to underscore. Then similarly meat, milk also contains the potassium, high level is also a true statement. By the way, in your notes all these things, did they come? They haven't? They have come? They are there in the notes, good. Now let us talk about CSF. How much is formed? Where is it formed? How is it absorbed? What is the common misconception for most of the students? Is it produced or absorbed by the arachnoid villi? Absorbed by the arachnoid villi. Any granulations in the arachnoid villi will prevent this absorption to occur, and that can lead to development of hydrocephalus, as all of you know very well. So it is the modified ependymal cells inside the choroid plexus which are responsible for the production of it, and arachnoid granulations will absorb it. And brain can contain only 130 to 150 ml of CSF, but it is produced at a rate of 500 ml per day. That means 350 ml every day should go out of the calvarium, otherwise hydrocephalus will occur. CSF pressure can range between 60 to 100 millimeters of water. So you must be sure on all these true statements. Now let us talk about the bilirubin. In the bilirubin metabolism, there are three important steps: uptake, conjugation, excretion into bile. Out of the three, it is the excretion into the bile, not the conjugation, which is the rate limiting step in the bilirubin metabolism, is what you have to basically remember. Then out of the total bilirubin of around 5.1 to 17, it is 1 to 5, that is a small part is only conjugated, and direct bilirubin predominantly it is unconjugated, is what we need to remember. Then how about carotenemia? What is the difference between hyperbilirubinemia and carotenemia? In the case of the carotenemia, the hue is only observed on the palms and the cheeks, that is on the skin, whereas the urine and sclera are not stained in the case of the carotenemia, which differentiates that from that of the hyperbilirubinemia, is what need to be remembered. Bilirubin has a high affinity for elastin and collagen are very much the true statements. Between the two, elastin has got a higher amount of affinity for the bilirubin. Now what are the substances reabsorbed in loop of Henle? We could not really recall what was the question exactly asked in the exam. If you can recall options, please write down and give. So anyway, I left you a small short note on descending limb, thin ascending limb, thick ascending limb and cortical thick ascending limb. What are the specific processes that happen? You must be very sure. Invariably one question comes out of them. Now let us talk about fatty acid metabolism. Fatty acid synthesis occurs in cytosol, whereas the beta oxidation occurs in mitochondria. You must be very specific about this basic fact. Now pantothenic acid is a part of the acetyl-CoA, and acetyl-CoA is very much required for the carbon transfer reactions and for the condensation of the oxaloacetate to citrate, and it has got a great role in the case of acetylation reactions also, as all of you know very well. The pantothenic acid is very important. Now why alcoholism leads to the toxic effects on the body? What is the underlying cause for that? The most important thing is the alcohol dehydrogenase, which has got NAD plus as the coenzyme, is very important for the metabolism of the alcohol. So this quickly reviews this pathway about what is the metabolic pathway of the alcohol. So whenever alcohol is metabolized, a lot of NAD plus is converted into NADH. Now if the NADH is high, what will happen? There is a effect of that high NADH on the pyruvate dehydrogenase. What is that? The pyruvate dehydrogenase will shut down, so that the pyruvate does not become acetyl-CoA and it does not enter into citric acid cycle. Rather, what will happen to pyruvate? Pyruvate will walk into the formation of lactic acid. So that is the reason there is a lactic acidosis tendency towards it, because more pyruvate is diverted towards the lactic acid rather than towards the citric acid cycle, because of this high NADH which is formed because of the alcohol dehydrogenase action, is what need to be remembered. Similarly, this excess NADH will also promote the glycerol synthesis, and it will promote the fatty acids to bind with the glycerol and triglyceride formation to occur, and excess triglycerides will do all the damaging effects. Similarly, the NADH also will be utilized inside the electron transport chain, and it has got a major influence on the other metabolic pathways which are catabolic in nature. So all the spoil sport which is done in the alcohol metabolism is done by the NADH, is what I like to finally underscore to all of you. Now let us go to the next question. In the DNA, if you happen to increase the salt concentration, what will happen? DNA is in the form of coils, otherwise called supercoils. There is a difference in the structure that will happen once the salt concentration is being changed. The main thing is the diameter and the thickness of the toroids of the DNA that become decreased if the salt concentration is being changed. That's the reason the supercoiling will increase because of the increased salt concentration, and supercoils will decrease with the decreased salt concentration. That is the main influence of the salt concentration on the DNA is what need to be remembered. Now if you look at the DNA structure, DNA is a simple double helix as proposed by Watson and Crick. But the DNA in our body did not study Watson-Crick that well. It has got two options. It can undergo a coiling called toroidal coiling, or it can undergo a coiling called plectonymic coiling. So whenever the salt concentrations are varied, it basically chooses whether to assume a more compact structure or more loose structure. So that is what is decided by the surrounding salt concentration is the minimum things that we need to know about this.